My wife gave me a grand gift on our 5th wedding anniversary, a divorce agreement signed with her name, she told me. My mom is seriously ill and doesn't have much time left. Her dying wish is for me to divorce you, but I promise, it's just a fake divorce. Once she passes, we'll remarry. Looking at my exhausted wife, I softened and agreed, but I never expected that as soon as we got divorced, she would post wedding photos with her first love on social media. Even my supposedly terminally ill mother-in-law appeared perfectly fine in the group photos. Chapter 1. George, when did you divorce your wife? My best friend David asked as soon as he sat down at my place, catching me off guard. Pausing for a second, he added, something this big, and you didn't even tell your buddy. I was stunned. Willow and I had indeed gotten divorced, but it was a fake divorce. 2 months ago, on our 4th wedding anniversary, Willow suddenly handed me a divorce agreement. She said, my mom is seriously ill. She doesn't have much time left, and her only dying wish is for us to get divorced. That news hit me like a ton of bricks. I had always known my mother-in-law didn't like me. She thought I wasn't a local and that my financial situation wasn't good enough. But after all these years of marriage, why would she still want us separated at the very end? I didn't say anything, and Willow grabbed my hand, pleading, George, I promise it's just a fake divorce. As soon as my mom passes, we'll remarry. Tears streamed down her face like a delicate, sorrowful flower in the rain. I had always given Willow anything she wanted. I adored her to the core. Seeing her cry shattered my heart. So in the end, I caved. But since it was only a fake divorce, not real, I hadn't bothered to tell anyone. So where did David hear about it? I turned to him and asked, where did you hear that? David widened his eyes and raised his voice in disbelief. Willow posted her marriage certificate with someone else on social media, and you're asking me where I heard it? George, we've been brothers for years. Something this huge happens, and you're still acting like nothing's wrong. David kept rambling, but my mind had already gone blank. A deafening buzz filled my head, drowning out his words. Willow posted a marriage certificate. That phrase echoed endlessly in my mind, silencing everything else. How was this possible? My hand started trembling uncontrollably. My heart pounded as if someone was smashing it with a sledgehammer, each strike leaving a dull, aching ring in my skull. A deep sense of unease and panic filled my chest, swallowing the dryness in my throat. I forced myself to stay calm and muttered, you're joking, right? I refused to believe it. After all, Willow and I had always had a great relationship. When she proposed the fake divorce, the sorrow in her eyes, every subtle expression, those moments still replayed vividly in my mind. We had spent 4 years together, overcoming countless challenges. I had always believed our love was unshakable. How could she suddenly marry someone else? But David's next words shattered the last sliver of hope I was clinging to. I'm not joking. It's true, David said seriously. If you don't believe me, call her and ask yourself. As he spoke, he tapped away in our old class group chat. Look, everyone else has seen it too. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that the chat was indeed flooded with messages about it. Someone asked, did I see this right? Willow got married. Another replied, wasn't she already married to George? How is she getting married again? Someone else chimed in, is this an April Fool's joke? They were the golden couple back in school. Even long distance and post-graduation struggles didn't tear them apart. How did they end up divorced? Another added, yeah, I still remember after graduation, when we were drinking together, George cried before making up his mind to follow Willow to her city. He even said that when they had kids, we'd all get together again. So how did things turn out like this? I couldn't read any further. My hands fumbled as I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed Willow's number. Chapter 2. The number you dialed is currently busy. The cold, robotic voice repeated endlessly through the receiver, drilling into my ears like a sinister chant. I refused to give up. I opened my chat history with Willow, only to realize that the last message I had sent was over a month ago, a picture of the dinner I had cooked for myself. Right there on the screen, a message from over a month ago stared back at me. I made your favorite spicy tofu today. When you come back, I'll make it for you again. The message sat there, lonely and unanswered. I scrolled up, my fingers trembling. The higher I went, the heavier my heart became. At some point, our conversation had turned into a one-sided monologue, just me, sharing my daily life, pouring out my love, message after message. Now, looking at them, they felt like cruel jokes, each one slapping me hard across the face. My hands shook as I typed, Willow, everyone's saying you got married. What's going on? The message vanished into the void. Then it hit me, she hadn't been responding to my messages for a while. Back then, when I called, she brushed me off, saying she was taking care of her sick mother and couldn't always answer the phone. She even said she was worried her mother might overhear and suspect something. I had believed her. For the past 2 months, no matter how much I missed her, I never disturbed her again. It never crossed my mind that she had blocked me. I wasn't ready to accept it. Desperate, I opened my social media, only to find that I had already been restricted. A wave of betrayal crashed over me. It felt as if the entire world had conspired against me, turning me into a clueless fool, a joke for everyone else to laugh at. David, I said, my voice squeezed through gritted teeth. Send me that picture. Each word clawed its way out of my throat, my chest trembling with each breath, every inhale like a jagged blade cutting through me. David glanced at my pale face and then at my phone screen, where my social media had been blocked. He finally realized that something was seriously wrong. Without hesitation, he sent the photo over. My hands were shaking so violently that I struggled to tap on the image. The man in the wedding photo was Makoto, Willow's first love. My fingers clenched into a fist. I knew Makoto. At my own wedding, he had stood in front of Willow in a sharp, tailored suit, looking more like the groom than I did. I had even asked Willow if she still had lingering feelings for him. Why else would she invite him to our wedding? But she had denied it, swearing to me, George, I chose to marry you. How could I still have feelings for someone else? I'm your wife. Do you really not trust me at all? I had believed her. Yet now, in this picture, she was nestled against Makoto, their faces radiating happiness. The bright red wedding decorations in the background pierced through me like a knife, stabbing straight into my heart. A crushing pain wrapped around my chest like a coarse rope, tightening until I could barely breathe. I typed frantically, Willow, answer me. Willow, say something. Tell me this isn't true. They must be lying. Right. You didn't really marry someone else, right? But my messages vanished into the void. No response. Not even a single word. I kept sending them until my fingers ached, but it was useless. Exhausted, I slumped onto the couch, my mind in chaos, my world crumbling around me. It was supposed to be a fake divorce, so why had Willow married someone else? Unless this was also fake. The thought struck me like lightning, igniting a flicker of hope in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was also a fake marriage. I shot up from the couch, not even bothering to respond to David's concerned questions. Grabbing my car keys, I stormed out the door. Chapter 3. The hospital was an hour's drive away. I got there in half the time. As soon as I parked, I stumbled out of the car like a madman and rushed straight into the hospital, heading for the inpatient department. Excuse me, I'm looking for someone named Sandra, I said, breathless. I gave the nurse my mother-in-law's name and asked, which room is she in? The nurse quickly typed into the computer, then glanced up at me with an indifferent expression. There's no patient named Sandra here. That's impossible. My voice trembled. She's my mother-in-law. My wife told me she was terminally ill and had been hospitalized for a long time. Holding onto a shred of hope, I added, could she have been discharged? Could you check the records for recently discharged patients? The nurse frowned slightly but checked again. Every patient who's been admitted here is in our system. The person you're looking for was never hospitalized at this facility. Maybe you should call and check if you have the wrong hospital. No. That's not possible. I shook my head numbly, taking an unsteady step back. I wasn't mistaken. Willow had told me countless times that her mother was being treated here. She had even sent me pictures of the hospital's interior. When I had offered to visit, Willow had refused, saying her mother was too weak and couldn't handle any stress. She had even choked up, pleading, George, please, just let me stay with my mom in her final days. She had lost so much weight in just a few days, looking so frail and heart-wrenching that I hadn't dared to insist on visiting. Could it be? This was all a carefully orchestrated lie. Her mother had never been sick, never been hospitalized. My mind went blank. Why? If Willow wanted to leave me, she could have just said so. I wasn't the type to beg or cling. Why go through all this effort to weave such a massive lie? I stood frozen for a moment before suddenly turning on my heel and striding out of the hospital. I had to find Willow and get answers. I got into my car and turned the key, but as I gripped the steering wheel, my hands suddenly stopped. I had no idea where the Liu family lived. My mother-in-law had never liked me. From the time Willow and I started dating to when we got married, I had never set foot in their house. Meanwhile, I had given everything to Willow. She knew my home address, my workplace, my salary, my entire life. Back then, she had reassured me, marriage is just about the two of us. As long as we love each other, that's all that matters. But now, her so-called love was gone, and I couldn't even find her. Bang. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel. The blaring beep-beep of the horn echoed through the car, but I didn't care. I hung my head, my vision blurring. For a long time, I sat there in silence. Then, gritting my teeth, I forced myself to pull it together. I started the engine and headed to Willow's office. 4 years, I had driven there to pick her up after work, no matter how exhausted I was. Rain or shine, I had never missed a day. Her colleagues used to tease her, saying, Willow, your husband is amazing. She would always smile happily. Now, the memory burned like a knife twisting in my chest. It was just around quitting time when I arrived. Employees were trickling out of the building, chatting as they left for the day. I stared at the entrance, waiting, but Willow never appeared. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed open the car door and strode toward the building. Just as I reached the entrance, I spotted a familiar face, one of Willow's colleagues. "Martin," I called out. He turned and blinked in surprise. "George, what are you doing here? Where's Willow?" I asked without hesitation. Martin hesitated for a second before answering. "Willow, she's on leave." I frowned. "Since when?" My throat was hoarse. Despair was creeping in, first her phone, then the hospital, and now even her office. "She took leave more than 2 weeks ago," Martin said, looking confused. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he added, "She said she needed time to prepare for her wedding." Chapter 4. Martin hesitated for a moment before adding, "We were all surprised. You two seemed so close. Together for so many years, we thought you had already been married." My lips trembled slightly as I forced out a few words. We were already married. Memories flooded my mind, the exhausting months of wedding preparations. From buying and renovating our home to choosing the wedding dress and decorating the venue, I had done everything on my own. Back then, Willow always said she was too busy with work and couldn't take leave. Even on our wedding day, not a single one of her colleagues showed up. Looking back now, it wasn't about being busy. The truth was painfully obvious. I had never mattered enough for her to take a day off. "George, what did you say?" Martin asked. Not catching my words, I didn't answer. Every breath I took felt like ice, chilling me to my core. No wonder Willow rarely wore her wedding ring. She had claimed it was inconvenient for work. The reality, her colleagues had no idea she was even married. I turned numbly and got into my car, driving away without any real sense of direction. One thought consumed me: I had to find Willow. Some things just gnaw at you. The more unanswered they are, the more desperate you become to uncover the truth. I called my workplace and requested leave. Then, I drove to every place Willow might be. First, the coffee shop she adored. She was obsessed with their coffee. I never cared much for it, but she insisted that every white-collar worker needed a daily cup. She used to joke that I should buy her one every day. Then, the revolving restaurant she loved. She always requested a window seat, gazing longingly at the city's most expensive skyscraper. Every time, she'd sigh dreamily, "George, when we have enough money, let's buy a place there." Imagine waking up to this view every morning. And finally, the beach where we had once set off fireworks together. By the time I arrived, night had fallen. Someone nearby was setting off fireworks. I watched as a man lovingly gazed at the woman beside him, the light of the fireworks illuminating her face. For a brief moment, I saw Willow. I could still remember the first time she saw fireworks light up the sky, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she turned to throw her arms around me, whispering, "George, no one has ever done something so special for me. Just being with you makes my life complete." I watched until my eyes burned red. This city wasn't large, yet it felt as if every corner was haunted by our memories. For the next 3 days, I searched like a madman. I scoured every place I could think of, but there wasn't a single trace of Willow. Sleep-deprived and exhausted, my body finally gave in. Outside the entrance of a movie theater we used to frequent, my legs buckled, the world spun around me, and I collapsed onto the pavement. A kind stranger called emergency services, and I was rushed to the hospital. The sharp scent of disinfectant filled my nose as I slowly regained consciousness. The first thing I saw was a nurse in a white uniform. I parted my dry lips, my voice hoarse. "What happened to me?" "You're awake." The nurse checked my forehead before replying. "You were under extreme mental stress and exhaustion. It caused temporary syncope." Then, she turned toward the door and called out, "Family member of bed 8, the patient is awake." Family. My heart clenched. Could it be? As the door slowly swung open, I looked up, filled with a desperate hope. Chapter 5. "George, you're finally awake." The voice wasn't the one I had been hoping for. The glimmer of light in my eyes was instantly extinguished. "David." It was my best friend, David. "You nearly scared the hell out of me," he grumbled, plopping down on the chair beside my hospital bed. "You have no idea what I thought when I got that call." "Seriously? All this over a breakup? Look at the state you've put yourself in." I cut him off abruptly. "Where's my phone?" David blinked in confusion. "What? Your phone?" He scanned the room before spotting it on the bedside table. Handing it to me, he asked, "What do you need it for?" I didn't answer. I unlocked it immediately, my gaze landing on the chat with Willow. The last message I had sent was still there, hanging in the empty void. "Are you really marrying someone else?" No response. Just that single, unanswered message, like a cruel joke at my expense. As I closed the chat, I accidentally tapped into my call history. My breath caught. Over 50 outgoing calls, all to the same number. The last one had been made right before I collapsed. Willow was my pinned contact, which meant when the hospital tried calling my emergency contact, they must have dialed her first. And yet, she hadn't answered, not even once. If David hadn't been in the same city, I might have died alone in this hospital, with no one even knowing. David sighed, seeing the shattered look on my face. "George, You're still hung up on her. His voice softened. Look at yourself. You're falling apart. Let me be real with you. Her wedding is set. She's getting married soon. A sharp pain pierced through my chest, and my body instinctively curled forward as I coughed violently, struggling to catch my breath. I gasped, my throat burning. When? David hesitated before finally answering. 3 days from now. His expression turned exasperated. Man, she's long moved on. She's off celebrating her new life while you're here looking like death itself. Let it go. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. For a long while, I just sat there, hollow and speechless. Finally, my voice came out in a hoarse whisper. Where is the wedding being held? 3 days later, I stood outside the Tyranny Hotel. It was a 5-star venue, an extravagant European-style building, Willow's favorite kind. Luxury cars lined the entrance. David had told me that the groom had booked 200 tables for the banquet. The sheer extravagance spoke for itself. David, standing beside me, frowned with concern. You're really going in? He glanced at me, worry etched into his features. I don't think this is a good idea. I shook my head. No. I clenched my fists. My gaze locked onto the wedding portrait displayed at the entrance. Willow stood beside Makoto, her hand gently resting on his arm. She was smiling, radiantly, blissfully. She wore an elegant white wedding gown, her beauty more dazzling than ever. My jaw tightened as I forced out, there are things I need to ask her, face to face. As soon as I finished speaking, someone in the crowd shouted, the bride is here. I froze. My entire body tensed as I slowly turned around. A long procession of BMWs approached in a neat formation, led by a single red BMW in the center. The cars rolled to a stop at the entrance, and guests swarmed forward eagerly. The driver's door opened, and Makoto stepped out first. He adjusted his suit, then turned back toward the car, extending a hand. A delicate, slender hand reached out, resting in his palm. With a gentle tug, Willow gracefully stepped out of the car. She looked stunning. Her makeup was flawless, enhancing her already striking features. Her eyes sparkled under the daylight, and when she turned to Makoto, she smiled, sweetly, intimately, like a playful kitten basking in attention, the same way she used to smile at me. Every time she looked at me like that, I had always forgiven her, no matter what. The crowd surged forward, pushing me further back. I stood at the edge, helplessly watching her from a distance. It had been 3 months since our fake divorce, and now, for the first time, I was seeing Willow up close again, at her wedding, to another man. Chapter 6. Willow didn't even see me. She held onto Makoto's arm, her face glowing with happiness as she greeted the guests. That smile, so bright, so dazzling, felt like a blade stabbing into my chest with every passing second. And then, stepping out of the car behind her, was the very woman who once claimed to be terminally ill, my mother-in-law. Except she wasn't frail, she wasn't dying. She looked healthy, radiant, and full of joy, a stark contrast to the disdainful, disapproving face she had always worn around me. Willow, Willow. My fingers clenched into fists, my voice sharp and trembling from a mix of fury and disbelief. The sound of my call cut through the chorus of congratulations, making Willow freeze in place. Slowly, she turned her head toward me. The moment she saw me, her smile vanished. In its place, panic, guilt, unease. Her grip on Makoto's arm instinctively tightened, and the other hand clutched her bridal bouquet so hard that her knuckles turned white. Many of the guests recognized me. Sensing the tension, curious gazes began shifting toward us. Then, her mother moved in swiftly, pushing through the crowd, her voice loud and commanding. All right, everyone, step aside. Let's not delay the bride and groom from entering. The auspicious time is approaching. As she spoke, she shoved me, attempting to force me away. I sidestepped, avoiding her touch, but my eyes never left Willow. My vision blurred with rage and betrayal as I roared. Willow, didn't you say this was just a fake divorce? A flicker of fear flashed across Willow's eyes. Beside her, Makoto turned to glance at her, frowning. Her mother, however, immediately snapped. Fake divorce, real divorce, it doesn't matter. A divorce is a divorce. Then, she pointed a furious finger at me, her voice laced with venom. George, I'm warning you, today is my daughter's wedding. Don't cause trouble. She tried to push me away again, but this time, David stepped forward, blocking her. I wasn't backing down. I locked eyes with Willow and took a step closer. My voice shook with anger as I gritted out. You told me your mother was dying, that you needed to comfort her. That's why we got divorced. Was that a lie too? Tell me, what the hell is going on? With every word, my chest burned with fury. The woman standing before me, dressed in a pure white wedding gown, looking as breathtaking as the day we met, now felt like a complete stranger. Time had moved so fast. It felt like just yesterday we were promising each other forever. Yet in the blink of an eye, she was here, marrying someone else. David shielded me from the gathering crowd, pushing past onlookers until I finally stood directly in front of Willow. Her hands trembled, fingers gripping her bouquet so tightly that the petals were being crushed. She opened her mouth, her voice low and urgent. "George, can we talk about this after the wedding?" She stole a nervous glance around at the guests, her tone pleading, her eyes filled with guilt. "It's not what you think. Let's talk later." "Okay, after the ceremony. I'll explain everything." Her expression was pitiful, as if she were the victim in all of this. If this were any other day, I might have softened, but not today. Today, I felt nothing but bitterness and rage. A cold, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "Willow, are you afraid I'll ruin your wedding? So you're trying to stall me again?" Her face flushed red in embarrassment. The crowd fell silent. Guests exchanged hushed whispers, unsure whether to intervene. Then, suddenly, a hand landed on Willow's shoulder. "Makoto." He tilted his chin up slightly, looking down at me with smug arrogance, as if he had already won. Then, with a mocking smirk, he spoke. "George, before you start accusing Willow, maybe you should take a hard look at yourself. She was married to you for 4 years, but never even had a child with you." Then, he let out a low chuckle, before dropping the bombshell. "Meanwhile, the child she had with me is already almost 5 years old." Chapter 7. What? It felt like an explosion went off in my mind. Makoto's words were like 1,000 razor-sharp shards stabbing into my body all at once. I stood there, frozen, completely numb, my brain unable to process what I had just heard. She had his child, 5 years ago. David reacted first, exploding with rage. "You two scumbags were messing around 4 years ago." His temper was never one to be restrained. He lunged forward and grabbed Makoto by the collar, shouting in his face, "You two, lying, cheating bastards, you played George for 4 years. His chest heaved with anger as he turned to Willow, his glare burning with fury. "And you," he spat, "if you already had a kid with another man, then why the hell did you still marry George? What kind of sick game were you playing?" Willow flinched, fear flashing in her eyes as she instinctively took a step back. "Let go of me," Makoto growled, yanking at David's grip. He struggled to break free as he sneered. "Who the hell do you think you are, putting your hands on me? Listen up. I was always the one Willow loved. We only broke up over a misunderstanding, and now that we've worked things out, he's useless to her." David clenched his teeth. "You piece of..." His fist flew. The punch landed hard against Makoto's jaw, sending him staggering backward. A thin trickle of blood seeped from the corner of his mouth. "Makoto!" Willow screamed, her face paling as she rushed toward him in undeniable panic. Seconds later, her mother called for security, and uniformed guards rushed in, grabbing David before he could throw another punch. I watched Willow fuss over Makoto, her concerned expression clear as day, and in that moment, something inside me finally snapped. I had loved Willow since college. After graduation, I had given up everything, my hometown, my family, my career prospects, just to be with her. I had known she had a past with Makoto, but back then, she had sworn to me, promised me, that he meant nothing anymore. "I only love you, George." She used to be so good to me. She kept the house clean, spoke to me gently, made me feel wanted. I had never doubted her, but slowly, over the years, she grew colder, distant. She started leaving everything to me, our home, our relationship, our marriage, and I had believed her excuses. Love changes, George. It doesn't always stay passionate. Sometimes, it just becomes companionship. I had foolishly accepted that, but now, looking at her face, pale, anxious, desperate over Makoto, I finally understood. It wasn't that love had changed. She had never loved me at all. Her love had always belonged to someone else. All she had ever given me was leftover affection, the scraps of a love that was never mine to begin with. I exhaled, my breath cold and shallow. "Willow." My voice was eerily calm. "Is it true? You had a child with him?" A suffocating silence fell over the crowd. Willow lowered her head. Her fingers clenched into the fabric of her dress. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, so faintly I almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "Yes." My chest went numb. The fire inside me, the desperate need for answers, the clinging hope for an explanation, died instantly. I nodded slowly. "All right, I understand now." I turned away. I didn't spare her another glance. I pushed past the security guards, grabbing David by the arm. "David, let's go." This was it. The only thing I could do now was walk away with whatever dignity I had left. David spat at Makoto's feet before following me, both of us turning to leave. But before we could get far, "George, wait." Willow's voice rang out behind me. Chapter 8. David glanced at me, noticing that I had no intention of stopping. Without hesitation, he continued walking alongside me. Who would have thought that Willow, in her heavy wedding gown, would lift the skirt and run after us? She lunged forward, grabbing my arm in a death grip. "George, don't go," she pleaded. I looked down at her coldly, my gaze detached and distant. "What more do you want?" Willow was gasping for breath, staring up at me, her voice trembling with desperation. "George, I had my reasons. Please, don't be angry. Just let the wedding finish. I'll come find you afterward, and I'll explain everything. David scoffed, ripping her hand off my arm. Explain, he sneered. There's nothing left to explain. She played you for 4 years. George, forget her. Willow's eyes filled with silent pleas, but I turned my head away. Without another word, I left with David. The moment we got into the car, David couldn't hold back his anger any longer. George, I'm telling you right now, do not fall for that woman's lies again. You gave her everything, and what did she do? She cheated on you, had a kid behind your back, and still pretended to love you for years. His fists clenched against the steering wheel, and her whole damn family, lying about her mom being sick, manipulating you like a fool. I swear, karma better come for them one day. He gritted his teeth, muttering curses under his breath, his hands itching to break something. I sat there, listening. I knew David was trying to make me feel better, but right now, I felt nothing. No pain, no anger, just a quiet, empty stillness inside me, like a lifeless sea that no longer stirred. When we reached David's apartment, I cut off his rant with a calm voice. David, I said, I need to pack my things. Can I stay at your place for a while? David immediately nodded. Of course, man. You don't even have to ask. Then, after a pause, his brows furrowed. You sure you don't want me to come with you? I gave a small smile. I'll be fine. Don't worry. In truth, I just wanted closure. If this was the end, I wanted it clean. I didn't want to be left in the dark like some pathetic fool. David hesitated, then sighed. All right, we're men. We can handle this. He patted my shoulder before heading upstairs. I drove home. I hadn't been back in days, too busy searching for Willow, running around the city like a madman. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed a thin layer of dust settling over the furniture. It reminded me of our relationship, once clean and untainted, now covered in neglect. I walked into the bedroom, packing only a few clothes. Then, I opened the drawer and pulled out the property deed. Since our fake divorce had turned out to be real, it was time to settle things properly. This apartment was mine. I had bought it in full before our marriage. Even after the divorce, it remained my personal property. I decided to sell it. With the money, I'd return home and spend time with my parents, the people who truly cared about me. After making my decision, I blocked Willow on everything. She no longer had any access to me. I moved into David's apartment and wasted no time. The sale went smoothly, too smoothly. Despite not being in the city center, the apartment had a quiet, desirable location, and within days, multiple buyers had contacted the real estate agent. By the end of the first week, I had already finalized negotiations. Everything was set. On the day of the final contract signing, the buyer, a young woman, arrived. She loved the apartment, praising every detail. We were just about to sign the contract when Willow suddenly appeared. Chapter 9. Willow froze when she saw the unfamiliar woman in my apartment. Then, her expression twisted with rage. She jabbed a finger at me, her voice sharp and accusing. George, our divorce was supposed to be fake, and you're already bringing another woman home. I didn't even bother responding. Without sparing her a glance, I turned back to the contract and prepared to sign. But before I could, Willow lunged forward, snatching the pen from my hand and hurling it to the floor. I'm talking to you. Are you deaf? The buyer flinched at Willow's outburst, glancing between me and the real estate agent. Clearly uneasy, I sighed, rubbing my temples. Turning to the buyer, I apologized. I'm really sorry. There's been a bit of a situation. Would it be possible to reschedule the signing? The buyer hesitated, then nodded. All right. She gave Willow a wary glance before hastily gathering her things. But before she could leave, Willow suddenly blocked her way. No one's leaving until we sort this out, she demanded, eyes flashing. I stared at her, feeling as if I were looking at a stranger. Back when I loved her, I only saw her good side. Even her temper and flaws had seemed endearing. But now, stripped of love's illusions, she looked nothing but ugly to me. Willow, I said, my tone icy, we're already divorced. You have no right to interfere in my life. I shoved her hand aside and turned to the buyer and agent, offering them an apologetic smile. I'm really sorry for the inconvenience. The agent gave me a knowing look before responding. No worries, Mr. Wong. I suggest you settle your personal matters first. With that, they hurried out of the apartment. I barely had time to walk them to the elevator before turning back, to find Willow still standing there, arms crossed, glaring at me like a scorned wife. George, we agreed this was just a fake divorce, she snapped. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Did you forget? You got married again. She pressed her lips together, her fingers brushing her earlobe, a nervous habit of hers. It's not what you think. My marriage to Makoto is fake too. And about the child, it was just an accident from 5 years ago. I never planned for things to turn out this way. Then she rambled on, her excuses flowing without hesitation. And my mom, she somehow found out about the kid and suddenly wanted to spend her last days with her grandchild. That's why she forced me to marry Makoto. She said it so naturally, so matter-of-factly, as if she had done nothing wrong. Then, with a straight face, she had the audacity to say, "George, we've been together for so many years. Can't you try to understand my difficulties?" For a second, I was speechless. If this had happened in the past, I might have bent over backward to justify her actions, even blaming myself. But now, I could only laugh. I wasn't blind. At the wedding, her mother had looked perfectly healthy, even strong enough to push me around. Terminally ill. What a joke. I fixed Willow with a cold, piercing stare. "You and Makoto registered your marriage. That makes it real. And since our fake divorce turned out to be real, we need to settle things legally. I've already hired a lawyer. Everything will be divided according to the law. As for this apartment, I bought it before we got married. It's mine. I'm selling it. From now on, don't ever come back here." Willow's face turned ghostly pale. She finally seemed to realize that I wasn't playing around. Her tough demeanor crumbled instantly. She stepped forward, reaching for my hand. "George, I won't even argue about you bringing another woman home. Just, don't be mad at me, okay?" Her fingers tightened around my wrist, her voice softening into a familiar, coaxing tone. "Once my mom passes, I promise, I'll come back to you. We'll get remarried." Chapter 10. No need. I pulled my hand away from Willow's grasp and said coldly, "You already have a child. Just live your life with Makoto. 3 years of dating, 4 years of marriage. For all these years, I had always been the one chasing after her. And in the end, what did I get? A wife who had been cheating on me, a marriage that was a lie, and a child that wasn't even mine. I was tired. I didn't want to have anything more to do with this woman." Sensing my unshakable resolve, Willow panicked. Her soft pleas turned into a full-blown tantrum. "George, this house is half mine. I won't let you sell it. And our divorce was just for show. Legally, we're still husband and wife." I let out a long exhale, trying to control my frustration. But in the end, I couldn't hold back. "Willow, you really have no shame." I glared at her, my voice razor-sharp. "Whether you own this house or not, it's not up to you. It's up to the law. And the law says I bought this place before marriage. It belongs to me. As for the divorce, every document is stamped and official. Do I need to show you the papers right now?" My words hit her like a slap. For once, Willow had nothing to say. I didn't want to waste another breath on her. I walked to the door, pulled it open, and said, "You can leave now." "George." She hesitated, still trying to cling on, but I had enough. I grabbed her arm and dragged her out, shoving her past the doorway. "Expect to hear from my lawyer." With one final push, I slammed the door shut. Bang. "George, George." She pounded on the door, screaming my name. I didn't listen. I turned away, heading straight to the bedroom. Inside, the wardrobe was still filled with Willow's clothes, neatly hanging, some brand new, tags still attached. Meanwhile, my own clothes were shoved into a small corner, old, worn out, barely taking up any space. I had never been one to spend money on myself, but for Willow, whatever she wanted, I gave. Now, standing here, staring at the vast difference between her section and mine, all I felt was disgust. How pathetic was I? I grabbed several large bags, stuffing them with every single piece of her clothing, along with every belonging she had left behind. Then, I walked to the balcony. Just as I looked down, I saw Willow stepping outside, rubbing her throat from all the yelling. She had just reached the ground floor when, crash, a bag full of her clothes landed right in front of her feet. "Ah!" Willow shrieked, stumbling backward in fright. When she looked up, her face twisted in disbelief. She saw me standing on the balcony, another bag in hand. Without hesitation, I dropped it over the edge. One by one, her clothes rained down, scattering across the pavement, like pieces of our past, shattered, scattered, and irreparable. Willow's eyes turned red. She knelt down, picking up each item, clutching them as if she could somehow piece back together what was already broken. But when she looked up again, I was gone. After getting rid of Willow, I focused on selling the apartment. I moved back in temporarily, just to make it easier for potential buyers to visit. But I underestimated just how shameless Willow really was. She refused to give up. Every single day, she showed up at my door, crying, pleading, trying to change my mind. At first, I simply ignored her, but when I stopped answering the door, she used her spare key. The worst day was when I was in the shower. I had just stepped out, a towel wrapped around my waist, when the bathroom door burst open. Willow threw herself at me, soaked, half naked. I barely caught myself from falling as she clung onto my bare skin. "George, please. I know I was wrong. This is our home. You can't sell it." Chapter 11. Just forgive me this one time. Okay. Willow's hand slithered over my skin like a disgusting snake, trying to provoke a reaction from me, but all I felt was revulsion. With a strong shove, I threw her off like tossing out garbage. That night, Willow cried, screamed, and thrashed around at my doorstep, making such a scene that the neighbors almost called security. She kept at it until nightfall, ignoring Makoto's calls, 18 of them, to be exact. It was only when his calls became relentless that she finally reluctantly left, turning back every few steps as if waiting for me to call her back. The moment she disappeared, I called a locksmith. By the time she returned the next day, her key was useless. No matter how much she pounded on the door, cried, or threatened, I refused to acknowledge her presence. I had assumed that if I ignored her long enough, she'd eventually give up. I was wrong, because a few days later, she returned, with her dying mother. Except, this time, Lou Mother brought a hammer. Bang, bang, bang. She pounded the hammer against my newly installed lock, the deafening noise echoing through the apartment corridor. Neighbors peeked out, whispering among themselves, watching the drama unfold. George, if you don't open this door, I'll come back every single day to break it down. I'll bring a damn loudspeaker and let the whole neighborhood know what kind of man you are. I clenched my jaw. I didn't want to escalate things. I still planned to sell this apartment, and the last thing I needed was a scandal driving away buyers. With a deep breath, I reluctantly opened the door. That was a mistake. The moment I did, Lou Mother and Willow stormed in like a pair of feral dogs. Lou Mother shoved me hard, her face twisted in fury. George, you already divorced my daughter. Why the hell are you still bothering her? Don't you have any shame? You were together for so many years, and you didn't even give her a child. What kind of man are you? Her shameless, slanderous words made my blood boil. Up until now, I had tried to handle things peacefully, but this was too much. I let out a low, cold laugh and fixed Lou Mother with a glare so sharp it could cut glass. You really don't know why Willow never had a child? My voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it. Lou Mother flinched, her eyes darting away for a split second. I took a slow step forward, my voice dripping with venom. Let me remind you. Flashback. When Willow and I first got married, Lou Mother moved into our home under the excuse of helping us adjust. In reality, she did nothing. She sat around all day, ordering us around like servants, while shoving bizarre herbal drinks down our throats. Drink this every day. It'll help you two have a baby faster. At first, I believed her. I trusted that she had our best interests at heart, so I drank it every single day. Months passed. No pregnancy. We didn't even use protection. I started to suspect something was wrong, so I secretly went to the hospital for a checkup, and the results? The so-called fertility tonic she had been giving me wasn't for fertility at all. It was a sperm-killing drug. That day, I had walked home shaking with fury, gripping the hospital report so tightly that it crumpled in my hands. And when I entered the apartment, the first thing I saw was Lou Mother, cheerfully holding out another steaming cup of poison. Here, George, drink up. I had been seconds away from throwing the damn cup to the ground and confronting her, but then, Willow walked in, exhausted, drained from work. She slumped into my arms with a sigh. George, I'm so tired. When will it finally be my turn for a promotion? She was at a critical point in her career, constantly overworked and stressed, and if I had exposed her mother's deceit right then and there, it would have only added to her burden. So I did nothing. Instead, I started pretending to drink the herbal medicine, secretly dumping it out every day. From that moment on, I never touched Willow again, because no matter how much I loved her, I could never trust her family again. Back to the present, I took another step toward Lou Mother, watching as she tried and failed to maintain her composure. So tell me, Lou Mother, why do you think we never had a child? She quickly recovered, straightening her back and sneering. Ha, that's just bad luck on your part. Some things are just karma. You must have done something in a past life. I smirked. You're right. I must have been blind in my past life to end up married to your daughter in this one. Then, I tilted my head, my eyes gleaming with mockery. But aren't you the one who was supposed to be dying? Tell me, Lou Mother, are you also getting karma for that lie? Chapter 12. George. Lou Mother's face turned a deep shade of purple, her chest heaving as she clutched at her heart. You dare curse me? She was so furious that she could barely form a sentence, her voice breaking from sheer rage. Willow, looking alarmed, immediately supported her mother, frowning at me as she scolded. George, my mom isn't in good health. Do you really have to provoke her like this? I snorted coldly. You're the ones who barged into my house. If you don't want her to be provoked, then get her the hell out. Willow bit her lip, hesitation flashing in her eyes before she spoke again. You're trying to kick us out so fast. Are you still planning to sell the apartment? George, you can't sell it. What? You're selling the house? Lou Mother's entire demeanor changed in an instant. Just seconds ago, she looked on the verge of fainting, but now, she was suddenly full of energy, her eyes sharp and alert as she pointed an accusing finger at me and screeched. You have no right to sell my daughter's house. But before I could respond, a strong and familiar voice echoed from the doorway. He has every right because the property deed is under my son's name. I instinctively turned my head toward the entrance, and there, standing in the doorway, was my father. Dad. Shock and joy rushed through me all at once. My father lived far away in Shaoqing. I never expected him to suddenly show up here. Dad, what are you doing here? I asked, still in disbelief. His expression was dark and furious. You idiot. If I hadn't come, you would have let these people walk all over you. With long strides, my father marched into the apartment, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. His cold, steely gaze swept over Willow and Lou Mother, before landing on me, and in his eyes, I saw disappointment. My heart sank. I knew exactly what he was thinking. Years ago, when I insisted on marrying Willow, he tried to warn me, a marriage without family's blessing will never be a happy one. He had even told me plainly, that woman doesn't love you, George, but I didn't listen. Blinded by love, I ignored his words and chased after Willow, leaving behind my hometown, my family, and everything I once had. My father had been so furious that he nearly cut ties with me. For 3 years, we had barely spoken, and now, after all this time, he had come all this way, because he already knew. He knew that Willow and I were divorced. Willow recognized my father immediately. For the first time that day, she hesitated, but then she forced a smile, attempting to greet him as if nothing had happened. Dad. My father let out a cold laugh, his glare making her stiffen. Then, raising a hand, he cut her off instantly. Enough. Don't call me that. Save it for your new father-in-law. Willow flinched. She glanced at her mother, uneasy, while Lou Mother shot my father a sharp glare. But before Willow could say anything, Lou Mother stepped forward, placing her hands on her hips as she sneered. Good. You came at the right time. Your son is trying to sell my daughter's house. As his father, you should stop him. My father's expression turned even colder. My son is divorced from your daughter. Don't call me in-law anymore, you old hag. Lou Mother's eyes bulged, her face twisting with rage, but my father didn't stop. This house is legally my son's property. The title is in his name. He can do whatever the hell he wants with it. Lou Mother was so furious she nearly choked. So what if it's under his name? This is a marital asset. They were married, that means half of it belongs to my daughter. Then, as if she owned the place, she turned, plopped down onto the sofa, and crossed her legs. I'll tell you this right now, we're not leaving until this is settled. Seeing this, Willow hesitated for a second, but then, with a deep breath, she walked over and sat beside her mother. She was making her stance clear. I had seen shameless people before, but never like this. I was so furious that I couldn't even speak, but before I could react, my father let out a low chuckle. He turned to me, patting my shoulder with a smirk. You see it now, don't you? This is why your mother and I never approved of her. Then, he turned to face the 2 women on the sofa, his gaze turning ice cold. Since you want to make this a legal matter, fine. Then let's call a lawyer. Right here, right now. Chapter 13. Lou's mother said, it's not enough for him to hire a lawyer alone. Who knows if the one he calls is on his side? She immediately started shouting, then turned to her daughter and ordered, you hire a lawyer too. We'll get 2 lawyers and make sure everything is sorted out. But, Willow hesitated for a moment, but under her mother's sharp glare, she obediently closed her mouth. She sneaked a glance at me before finally lowering her head, taking out her phone, finding a law firm, and making the call. Lou's mother shot us a triumphant look. My father patted my shoulder and said calmly, we'll sit and wait for the lawyers too. So, we all sat on the sofa, quietly waiting for the 2 lawyers to arrive. Before long, they arrived one after the other. As soon as they stepped inside, Lou's mother impatiently grabbed the female lawyer she had hired and exclaimed, this house belongs to my daughter. You must help her get it back. The female lawyer gently patted Lou's mother's hand, signaling her to calm down. Then, she turned to look at me and Willow and asked, when was this house purchased? Can I see the property deed? Before I could say a word, Lou's mother jumped in. I know this. They bought it after they got together, so it's marital property. My daughter is entitled to a share. The female lawyer frowned slightly, gave Lou's mother a glance, and then asked, and how was the purchase funded? This time, I answered first. I paid for it in full. The female lawyer's expression instantly turned serious. She exchanged a look with the male lawyer on my side. Both of them understood what the other's expression meant. The male lawyer spoke up. Madam, according to current marriage laws, only assets acquired during the marriage, such as salaries, bonuses, labor income, business and investment earnings, intellectual property proceeds, and inheritances or gifts, are considered joint marital property. This house was fully paid for by the husband before the marriage. Since it was not acquired during the marriage, it belongs to him alone. The wife has no claim to it. But Lou's mother refused to back down. He's just a poor boy from out of town. How much money could he possibly have? My daughter told me that even before they got married, she handed her salary card over to him. Sure, He used his own money to buy the house, but he spent my daughter's money for everything else. My daughter was too naive, that's the only reason she let him put the house solely in his name. She turned back to the female lawyer and pleaded, "You're a woman too, you should understand how hard it is for women. My daughter has already suffered enough from this divorce, and now she's being cheated out of her rightful property. You must stand up for us." The female lawyer looked conflicted. She glanced at Lou's mother, then at me. Unsure of who was telling the truth, I turned to look at Willow. She let her mother go on with the unreasonable arguments, but she herself remained completely silent, her head down, anxiously picking at her fingers. I felt a wave of cold disappointment wash over me. I stared directly at Willow and asked, "Don't you have anything to say?" Willow abruptly looked up at me. I locked eyes with her and pressed on. "You, more than anyone else, know whether I ever spent your money or not. During our years together, I felt sorry for how hard she worked. When she told me she didn't want to do house chores, I took on most of them myself, making sure our home was always in order. Not only that, but I worked harder at my job than she did. Most of our household expenses were covered by my income. As for her money, it all went towards socializing, hanging out with friends, shopping, and buying designer bags, clothes, and jewelry, never once spending a dime on me. Even the so-called salary card she had given me was taken back later under the excuse of saving for a car. Of course, she never actually bought the car, she always claimed she didn't have enough money. On our wedding anniversary, I had saved up for months, cutting back on everything, just to buy her the red BMW she had been dreaming of. I made a special trip to pick up the car and drove it to her office building, waiting outside, eager to surprise her. But I waited from morning until nightfall. The office was nearly empty, yet she still hadn't come down. My calls went unanswered. In the end, it was a coworker working late who told me that Willow hadn't been showing up at work for a while. That night, I sat in the car for a long time, my mind racing with countless thoughts. It wasn't until much later that my phone finally rang. Chapter 14. To my surprise, it was Willow who sounded impatient the moment she spoke. "Why do you keep calling me? Don't you know I'm busy?" I said. "I went to your office." There was silence on the other end. I continued, "Your coworker said you took leave. Where have you been?" Willow stayed quiet for a moment before explaining. "I'm at the hospital. My mom is sick." Hearing that my mother-in-law was ill, all the frustration I had built up instantly turned into worry. I asked, "What happened? Which hospital? I'll come over right now." "No need," Willow quickly said. "You don't have to come." She hesitated before continuing. "You know my mom doesn't like you. She doesn't want to see you. That's why I didn't tell you. I didn't want you to overthink it. Don't worry. I'm here to take care of her. Everything's fine." She kept stopping me from seeing her mother. I felt uneasy about it, but to avoid putting Willow in a difficult position, I let it go. But now, Lou's mother was sitting here, perfectly healthy, and even trying to take what was mine. Watching Willow sit there like a turtle retreating into its shell, I found her more and more unbearable. I said, "Willow, do you want me to pull up the financial records from all these years for you to see?" Hearing that, she finally reacted. She shook her head in frustration and snapped at her mother. "Can you stop making a scene? I didn't pay a single cent for this house. George bought it himself." Lou's mother panicked at those words. "How can you say that? I see what's happening. You're still speaking up for him, aren't you? Willow, stop being so kind and think about yourself for once." I nearly laughed in disgust. How could she say something so shameless? Even Willow couldn't take it anymore. "Enough. Are you leaving or not? If you don't leave, I will." She stood up to leave, but her mother yanked her back forcefully. "No, the lawyers are here. We have to settle this today." "That's right," I agreed. Then, under Lou's mother's sharp glare, I slowly stood up. I said, "You're right. Since the lawyers are here, we should also talk about the fake illness insurance fraud you committed." Lou's mother's voice immediately rose. What insurance fraud? I'm warning you, don't make things up." She tried to sound confident, but there was a clear trace of guilt in her tone. I smirked. "If I were making it up, we could just check your medical records to find out." I spoke calmly. "A year ago, you bought a critical illness insurance policy, which you paid for using my phone. 3 months ago, you already made a claim on that policy. If you weren't actually sick, that means you committed fraud." I held up my phone and added, "I can call the police right now." You. Lou's mother's face instantly turned pale. The arrogance she had just moments ago completely disappeared. Willow quickly grabbed her mother and urged, "Mom, stop talking and let's go." Then, without another word, she dragged her mother toward the door. Lou's mother's face was flushed red with embarrassment, but she didn't dare say another word as she was pulled away. The female lawyer glanced at them awkwardly before leaving as well. Watching Willow struggle to drag her mother away, I finally understood why. Despite her constant attempts to mediate, things had only gotten worse between us over the years. Her mother was just too overbearing. If she wasn't confronted with undeniable force, she wouldn't listen, not even to her own daughter. Mr. Wang, it looks like the matter is settled, the male lawyer said as he stood up. Congratulations, I replied. Thank you for your help. I shook his hand and added, I still need your assistance in sorting out the division of assets. I had no intention of getting entangled with Willow any further. I had spent some money today, but at least, for now, I had put an end to the trouble caused by Lou's mother. I let out a sigh of relief. After seeing the lawyer off, only my father and I remained in the house. Chapter 15. My father's eyes turned red as he stared at me. After a long moment, he lifted his hand and gently patted my head. He said, You went through a divorce and didn't even tell us. If David hadn't called, your mother and I would have still been in the dark. There was a mix of anger and pain on his face. What? Are you really so mad at us that you don't acknowledge your mother and me anymore? Looking at my father, a wave of sadness surged through me. People are strange creatures. When you're alone, you can endure any kind of hardship, but the moment someone shows you genuine care, you break down instantly. My father had only said 2 sentences, but I was already on the verge of tears. I lowered my head and quickly wiped my eyes, embarrassed. Dad, where's Mom? How have you two been all these years? After our last argument, my father had stopped answering my calls. In the beginning, I had David call him instead while I listened in. If I had anything to say, I'd have David relay it for me. But as time went on, I got busier with work and had more things to deal with. Eventually, I only had David check in on them occasionally. Fortunately, my parents were still in good health. My father said, Your mom had a cold recently and wasn't feeling well, but she's much better now. He patted my arm and added, When she heard about your divorce, she was really worried. She wanted to come with me, but since she's still coughing, I came alone. He glanced around the room and continued, You've made a name for yourself in the capital over these years. You even managed to buy a house. I smiled, my eyes still glistening with tears. I said, But I still miss being home. Dad, once I sell this house, I'll go back with you to see Mom. My father nodded repeatedly. Good. Going home is a good idea. Big cities have more opportunities, but they're also exhausting. Look at you, you've lost so much weight. Your mother's going to worry when she sees you. He started rambling on and on. I never remembered my father being this talkative. He had always been a man of temper, but after all these years apart, he seemed like a different person, gentler, more sentimental. Looking at the strands of white in his hair, guilt settled deep in my heart. This time, when I go back, I must spend more time with my parents and take good care of them. Over the next week, I listed the house for sale at a slightly lower price than the market value. Without Willow and her mother causing trouble, the house sold quickly. Afterward, I reviewed the financial division statement the lawyer sent me. According to it, not only did I not owe Willow any money, but she actually owed me. But I didn't care anymore. As long as I got back the major assets, that was enough. I had no interest in getting tangled with her any further. I directly sent a copy of the financial division statement to Willow's email. She never responded, and I never reached out to her again. On the day my father and I were leaving, David made a special trip to see me off. He was reluctant to part, sighing, Our dorm brothers were 4. You were the only one still here with me, and now even you're leaving. What am I going to do without you? I'll be so lonely. Why don't you take me with you? I couldn't help but laugh. I knew David just didn't want to say goodbye. But this guy was about to get married, and his fiancée loved him dearly. There was no way he'd actually be lonely. Even knowing that, I still felt a bit sentimental because of him. I teased, Come on, I know you too well. Don't be dramatic. I'll be back for your wedding. Then, after giving him a firm hug, I turned and boarded the plane with my father. As the plane took off, I watched the capital city grow smaller and smaller, an indescribable feeling welling up in my chest. If it hadn't been for Willow, I would never have come to the capital in the first place. I never had grand ambitions. I would have been content staying in my hometown. But because Willow wanted to stay in the city and convinced me to pursue opportunities here, I had left everything behind. Now, 3 years had passed in a blur. At least I had managed to save enough for a house and gained valuable work experience. And now, I was going back home to start over. I began imagining my future. With the few million I had now, I could buy a spacious new home in my hometown. As for the rest of the money, I planned to start my own tech company. I had the experience, and there weren't many companies like that in my hometown. I might be able to make something of it. However, the moment I stepped through the door upon arriving home, before I could even say a word, I was greeted by the sound of violent coughing from inside. A harsh, gut-wrenching cough that made my heart skip a beat. Chapter 16. My father and I exchanged a glance before hurrying inside the house. As soon as we stepped in, I heard my grandmother's voice. You should go to the hospital and get checked. Between coughs, my mother replied, It's nothing serious, just a little cold. I have to wait for George. I have to wait for him to come home. Hearing that, I quickened my pace and called out loudly, Mom. My mother was covering her mouth. coughing violently. But the moment she heard my voice, her eyes lit up with joy, and she looked up at me. "George, you're finally back." "Mom." I dropped my luggage and rushed to her side, wrapping my arms around her tightly. My voice trembled as I said, "Mom, I'm sorry for making you worry." She held me just as tightly, her voice choked with emotion. "It's okay. It's okay, as long as you're home." She pulled back, her teary eyes scanning me carefully. With trembling hands, she reached up and gently stroked my face. Between coughs, she said, "You've lost weight. Life must have been tough on you these past years." I shook my head quickly and looked at her in concern. "Mom, your coughing is really bad. Dad said it was just a cold, but have you been to the hospital?" "Oh, it's nothing." She coughed even harder before weakly waving her hand. "Just a little cough. I'll be fine after resting for a few days." My grandmother interjected from the side. "How can this be, just a little cough? She's been coughing so badly at night that she can't even sleep. I've been telling her to see a doctor, but she wouldn't listen. She kept saying she didn't know when you'd be back and wanted to see you first." "Mom." My mother shot my grandmother a glance, signaling her to stop talking. My eyes stung with guilt. "Mom, it's my fault. I should have come back sooner. You silly child." My mother shook her head with a gentle smile. "As long as you're home, that's all that matters," I immediately said. "Then let's go to the hospital right now." "There's no need." She tried to refuse, but she couldn't withstand my relentless persuasion. Eventually, she gave in, and we left for the hospital. On the way there, I touched her forehead and realized she had a fever. Maybe now that her heart was at ease, her body finally let go of its tension, and the illness surfaced. My father sped to the hospital, and after a round of examinations, the doctor's expression turned serious. "She has pneumonia, and her lungs are already showing signs of white lung. She needs to be hospitalized immediately." I clenched my fists, guilt washing over me. I should have come back sooner. My mother, however, comforted me instead. "It's just pneumonia. It's not like it's untreatable." My father nodded in agreement. "That's right. As long as she follows the doctor's instructions, she'll recover." We hurried to arrange for a hospital stay, but since it was peak pneumonia season, there were no available beds. We had no choice but to settle for a temporary spot in the hallway. That night, I stayed by my mother's side without sleeping. Early the next morning, I was jolted awake by my ringing phone. I checked the screen and was surprised to see Willow's name. I had sent her the financial settlement email earlier, but she never responded. I thought she had finally given up on bothering me. Why was she calling now? I frowned, but before I could think too much, a nurse called out, "Lisa." "Here." Hearing my mother's name, I immediately hung up and waved my hand. "We're over here." The nurse glanced at us and said, "There's a bed available now. Come with me." Overjoyed, I quickly packed up our things and woke my mother so we could move to the room. Once she was settled in, I sent a message to my father. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, my phone rang again. I looked down. Willow was calling me again. My frown deepened. We were already divorced. She had moved on and started a new family. Why was she still calling me? Chapter 17. I didn't answer the call, but from that day on, Willow seemed determined to get a hold of me. She called every single day, frustrated beyond words. I simply blocked her. Right now, all my attention was on taking care of my mother. The doctor had warned that her pneumonia was severe, so I didn't dare slack off. During the day, I closely monitored her 4 drips, and at night, I only allowed myself a short nap on the hospital's companion bed. After a few days of this, my father forced me to go home and rest, dragging my exhausted body back home. I planned to take a shower, get some sleep, and then cook something my mother liked before bringing it to the hospital. But the moment I stepped inside, I heard a familiar voice. "Grandma, I've been so busy with work that I haven't had a chance to visit you. I heard from George that you like the pastries from this shop, so I bought one of each flavor for you to try. Tell me which one you like best, and I'll get more next time." My grandmother's face lit up with joy. "Oh, how sweet of you. Our George is so lucky to have married you. I love all of them." Willow replied cheerfully, "I'm glad to hear that." My expression darkened as I walked toward the entrance hall. There, on the sofa, sat Willow and my grandmother. They were chatting warmly, with my grandmother holding her hand affectionately. No one in my family, especially my grandmother, knew that Willow and I were divorced. Since the day I returned, I had been too preoccupied with my mother's illness to bring it up, and given my grandmother's fragile health, no one dared to break the news to her. Looking at my grandmother's happiness, I felt a mix of emotions. Back then, my father had opposed my marriage to Willow, but I had clung to my grandmother, begging her to speak on my behalf. I even stole my household registration book just to make the marriage happen. If she found out about the divorce now, she would undoubtedly blame herself. That's why I had planned to find the right moment to gently ease her into the truth. I hadn't expected Willow to take advantage of the situation. When she saw me enter, her eyes lit up, and she called out, "George." I ignored her completely. My grandmother chuckled and teased, Young couples these days. You've only been apart for a few days, and she's already missing you. George, look at this. Willow came all this way just to see you. I swallowed back my irritation and said, Grandma, don't you usually take a nap around this time? It's getting late. You should rest for a while. Oh, I understand. My grandmother gave me a knowing smile and said, you two need some private time. All right. Grandma won't get in the way. She patted Willow's hand affectionately before heading to her room. The moment she was out of sight, I grabbed Willow's wrist and dragged her outside. She stumbled and shook me off, clutching her arm as she complained, you're hurting me. I stared at her coldly. Why are you here? She pouted. George, your birthday is coming up in a few days. I came to celebrate with you. Willow tilted her head slightly, her eyes gleaming. I even bought you a gift. Don't you want to know what it is? Hearing that, I couldn't help but laugh mockingly. All those years we were together, she had always found a way to completely forget my birthday. I had reminded her a few times, only to be scolded for being petty, told that a grown man shouldn't fuss over such things. Now that we were divorced, she suddenly remembered and was eager to celebrate with me. I looked at her and said, Willow, don't you think this is ridiculous? Chapter 18. I didn't hold back. We're already divorced. Willow, you have a new family now. Southwest, please recognize your place and stop bothering Maine. And one more thing, Grandma doesn't know about our divorce yet. She's old, and I don't want to upset her. I hope you'll have enough decency to keep your mouth shut. As soon as I finished speaking, I turned around, stepped inside, and slammed the door shut. George. Willow threw herself against the door, her voice choked with tears. To me, you will always be my husband. That will never change. Her voice was muffled behind the tightly closed door. I stood there for a long time, waiting until there was complete silence outside before finally walking further into the house. For the next few days, I continued shuttling between home and the hospital. Whether it was my warning or something else, Willow stopped coming around. My mother's pneumonia also gradually improved. Just when I thought the tough days were finally over, Makoto's sudden appearance shattered my peace completely. The phone rang, and my grandmother's trembling voice came through. George, tell me the truth, did you really divorce Willow? In the background, I could hear Makoto yelling furiously. Ask him yourself. Ask him if they've been divorced this whole time. Grandma's voice quivered. George, please, tell Grandma. My heart clenched. Grandma, don't listen to them. Just wait for me, I'll be home soon. I hung up immediately and bolted out the door. As I ran, I called my father. Dad, Makoto's at the house, Grandma's alone. Get back there, now. I flew down the stairs, my mind racing, jumped into my car, and sped toward home. By the time I reached the front door, I was breathless, my hands shaking so badly that it took several tries to get the key into the lock. Inside, Makoto's voice rang out, sharp and angry. That George of yours is a shameless bastard. He's already divorced but keeps pestering Willow, making her abandon me and our child. Your whole family must be trash if you raised a son like that. What? Can't he survive without a woman? He just has to cling to her. Bang. I shoved the door open violently, but what I saw next made my mind go blank. Grandma was on the floor, clutching her chest. Grandma. A deafening roar filled my head as my vision blurred. I stumbled forward, my knees hitting the floor with a thud, and pulled her into my arms. Grandma, wake up. Her eyes were shut tight, her face twisted in pain, her hand clutching her chest desperately. Makoto took a step back and quickly defended himself. This isn't my fault, I didn't even touch her. Just then, my father rushed in, the moment he saw Grandma on the ground. His face drained of color. Quick, we have to get her to the hospital. I didn't even spare Makoto another glance. I scooped Grandma up in my arms, holding her as if she were the most fragile thing in the world, and sprinted out the door with my father. In the car, my hands shook violently as I struggled to call the hospital's emergency desk. We raced toward the nearest hospital, where a team of nurses was already waiting at the entrance with a mobile stretcher. I ran alongside the stretcher as they wheeled her in, my tears falling uncontrollably. Grandma, please, look at me. She remained unresponsive, her face a frightening shade of purple. The stretcher disappeared behind the emergency room doors, and my father and I were forced to stop outside. The red emergency light switched on. My legs buckled. I nearly collapsed right then and there, but my father grabbed me and held me up. Son, don't panic. Sit down first. My entire body was trembling as I forced myself onto a chair. I turned to my father, my eyes filled with fear and desperation. Dad. Grandma's going to be okay, right? Chapter 19. She'll be fine. She has to be. That's what my father said. But his face told a different story. His expression was heavy, filled with a silent, unbearable weight. We stood frozen, staring at the tightly shut doors of the emergency room, barely daring to blink. Time lost all meaning. Then, The red emergency light flickered off. Both of us shot to our feet, eyes locked on the door as it slowly opened. The doctor stepped out first. The moment he saw us, regret clouded his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "Despite our best efforts, the patient did not survive." Time of death, February 17th, 2:28 p.m. My deepest condolences. A deafening roar filled my head. "Grandma is dead." The doctor kept talking, his lips moving, but I couldn't hear a single word. One thought consumed me. I killed her. I killed my grandmother. George. A voice, distant yet sharp, cut through the suffocating fog in my mind. I turned my head numbly. Willow. Clicking heels echoed through the silent hallway as she rushed toward me. "Is Grandma okay?" she asked breathlessly. "George, I swear, I didn't know Makoto would come. I didn't know he would go after your grandmother. Please, believe me, I never meant for any of this to happen." She reached out, trying to take my hand. "I'll stay with you. Okay, don't worry. Grandma is strong, she'll be fine." Before she could touch me, I slapped her hand away. Willow flinched in shock, her eyes widening. Before she could process what was happening, smack! A loud, merciless slap rang out as my palm struck her face. Hard. "Get out." I spat the words like poison. "Get the hell out, Willow." Willow stumbled back, clutching her burning cheek, completely stunned. It took her a few seconds to process what had just happened. Then she realized people were watching. Patients, families, nurses, all eyes were on us. Some whispered, some pointed. Embarrassment, anger, and humiliation twisted Willow's face. She screamed, "You're insane. I told you I didn't mean for this to happen. Why are you taking it out on me?" Willow, my father, barely holding himself together, stepped forward. His voice was hoarse, exhausted. "Go home. I'm not leaving." Willow's stubbornness flared. She held her cheek, glaring at both of us. Then, something seemed to click in her mind. She turned to my father, fury in her eyes. "I get it now," she sneered. "You've always hated me. You never wanted George to be with me, and now you're using this as an excuse to turn him against me. I know you never thought I was good enough, but face it, George married me. We're family. Whether you like it or not, stop trying to drive us apart." Then she turned toward the emergency room. "And as for Grandma, please, she's probably faking it. The doors are open. If she were really that sick, would they just leave her there?" "Willow," I snapped. My voice came out hoarse, raw, nearly unrecognizable. I lifted my head, staring at her with bloodshot eyes. And then, I said it. "Grandma is dead." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Willow froze. She blinked at me, confusion flickering across her face. Then she laughed, a short, nervous, disbelieving sound. "You're joking, right? That's not funny, George." She looked between me and my father, searching for any sign that this was a lie. But all she found was grief. Her breath hitched. "You're lying." She took a step back. "You're making this up. This is some sick joke you two planned to get rid of me." I stared at her. "Willow," I said coldly, "how long are you going to keep living in your delusions?" She flinched. "You betrayed our marriage first. You moved on. You have a husband. You have a child. So why do you keep coming back to ruin my life?" For the first time, I saw it. Fear. She looked into my eyes, the eyes of a man who had just lost the only person who had ever truly loved him, and for once, she had no words, but I knew. She wasn't here because she loved me. She wasn't here because she regretted anything. She was here because she couldn't accept that I didn't want her anymore. That thought alone made me sick to my stomach. I looked at her, and all I felt was regret. If I had never fought to be with Willow, Grandma wouldn't have met her. If I had listened, if I had stopped being so stubborn, Grandma wouldn't have died. Makoto and Willow might have pushed her to her death, but I was no less guilty, because I was the one who let them into our lives. Chapter 20. My hands clenched tightly, my nails digging deep into my palms, drawing streaks of red, yet I felt no pain at all. Willow was stunned by my accusations. Her lips trembled, but she couldn't utter a single word. My dad, his voice hoarse, said, "Miss Liu, we need to take care of the funeral arrangements. You should leave. You may not have killed her with your own hands, but in the end, she died because of you. We don't want to see you right now." Willow's breathing was rapid. She stared at me, her eyes slowly reddening. After a long moment, she finally turned and left. As I watched her go, the emotions I had been holding back finally crumbled. I collapsed into a chair, buried my face in my hands, and sobbed uncontrollably. My mother learned about Grandma's passing on the day she was discharged from the hospital. She blacked out for a moment, and if my dad hadn't been beside her, she would have fainted on the spot. I dropped to my knees in front of her with a thud. I said, "I'm sorry, Mom. It's all my fault. I was blinded by my own stupidity. I didn't listen to you. I insisted on marrying Willow. Grandma died because of me." Tears streamed down my mother's face. She looked at me, pain flashing through her expression, then reached out and helped me up. She said, This isn't your fault. No one could have predicted the future. The only one to blame is the bastard who provoked your grandmother. We can't let him get away with this. I gritted my teeth. Mom, don't worry, I won't let him get away with it. After sending my mother home, I started making arrangements for Grandma's funeral. Her body was kept in the funeral home for 3 days before we held the ceremony. On the day of the funeral, many people came. For a brief moment, I thought I saw Willow among them, but when I looked again, she was gone. I ignored it. After Grandma's funeral, I went to the police station and filed a report. I said, "Officer, Willow has been harassing me non-stop. Her actions have seriously disrupted my life, and her husband broke into my home without permission, verbally abused an elderly woman, and directly caused her death. Under these circumstances, I can file a report, right?" The officer was taken aback by my cold, lifeless tone. He immediately replied sternly, "Of course, if a person's actions result in someone's death, it constitutes a criminal case. We can open an investigation. We will summon the suspects to the station immediately." Willow and Makoto had not returned to the capital yet, but both of them had gone into hiding. The police couldn't locate them right away, so they told me to wait. It wasn't until the following afternoon that they summoned me back to the station. When I arrived, both Makoto and Willow were already there. The moment he saw me, Makoto's expression darkened, and he immediately started cursing at me. "George, how dare you call the cops?" I stared at him coldly and said, "Why wouldn't I? My grandmother died because of you too. You have to take responsibility for your actions." Makoto sneered. "That old hag died from her own illness. I just told the truth. What does that have to do with me?" He refused to admit any wrongdoing. Luckily, the Wong family had security cameras. When I reported the incident, I had already handed over the surveillance footage to the police. The officer played the video. Makoto's voice was crystal clear in the recording. "This is your fault for not raising him properly. People like you don't deserve to live." With every insult, the officer's frown deepened. By the time the video ended, Makoto's face was a mix of red and pale. He still tried to argue. "Okay, maybe I was a little harsh with my words, but I didn't lay a hand on her. Her death has nothing to do with me." Chapter 21. The officer said sternly, "You didn't have permission to enter the residence, which already constitutes a crime. Furthermore, your words and actions, which provoked someone and led to their death, also violate the law. The final ruling will, of course, come from the court." Makoto immediately slumped in his chair, as if his energy had been drained. Looking defeated, the officer then turned to Willow. "As for Ms. Liu," before he could finish, a sharp voice interrupted. "Wait." I turned to see Liu's mother rushing in. Fuming with anger, she walked straight towards me and raised her hand as if to slap me. Having been bullied by her for so many years, I was ready for her move. As she reached for me, I grabbed her wrist first and pushed her back. Liu's mother staggered, tripping backward. There was a loud crack as she twisted her ankle, causing her to scream in pain. "George, you unfilial wretch, how dare you hit an elder?" I sneered and replied, "What elder are you?" She shot back. "I'm your mother-in-law," I retorted. "Now you're Makoto's mother-in-law." Liu's mother ground her teeth and pointed at me, clearly wishing she could poke my eyes out. The officer intervened. "Enough noise." With a loud thud, he slammed a stack of papers onto the table. "Do you think this is a marketplace?" he said. "Stop the shouting." He then turned to Willow, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Ms. Liu, according to the information, you just divorced Mr. Wong and then married Mr. Makoto. If that's the case, why are you still clinging to your ex-husband?" Willow was caught off guard by the question. She couldn't admit to the fake divorce, leaving her speechless. Any other excuse she could offer was quickly dismissed. The officer's eyes held more and more mockery as he continued. "Ms. Liu, since you no longer have a legal marriage with Mr. Wong, your actions of illegally entering another person's home are confirmed. You will be detained for processing." Liu's mother's face changed. "What? Detained? No way," she protested. The officer stared coldly. "This is the police station, not a place where you make the rules. With the testimony and evidence we've gathered, it's clear your daughter and Mr. Makoto illegally entered someone else's home, and Mr. Makoto's actions led directly to someone's death. They must be detained and await trial." Liu's mother scoffed. "What death? He only said a few harsh words. What law says you can't speak your mind anymore?" She continued to stubbornly defend Makoto. "Even if he did upset that old lady, it wasn't intentional. It was just a careless mistake." She repeatedly sided with Makoto. I couldn't help but sneer inwardly. It wasn't surprising. She had always favored her son-in-law. If I were in Makoto's place, I imagined Liu's mother would have eagerly pushed me into a prison cell. Makoto, encouraged by someone defending him, suddenly seemed energized again. "That's right. I didn't know she would suddenly pass out. She probably had a condition already. I'm innocent." Willow, however, had been silent throughout. She seemed as if her soul had been drained, watching Makoto and her mother hysterically argue without a word. The fact remained that my grandmother had died in front of Makoto. No amount of arguing could change that. The officer, initially trying to reason with them, soon grew tired and had Makoto and Willow detained. Lou's mother tried to stop the officers, but she was quickly restrained. The officer frowned and warned, "If you continue to interfere with our work, we'll charge you with obstruction and arrest you as well." Chapter 22. As soon as the officer spoke, Lou's mother quieted down. Though she wasn't entirely satisfied, she turned to look at me, her eyes filled with venom, as if she wished she could tear me apart. I didn't respond. This was the police station, and if Lou's mother dared to do anything reckless, she'd end up in jail alongside her beloved son-in-law. "Mr. Wong, once the verdict is reached, we will notify you," the officer said. Hearing that, I left with satisfaction. Since Willow's involvement wasn't severe enough to warrant a conviction, she was released after half a month of detention. However, Makoto still had to face legal consequences. The day before the verdict, I went to the police station to see Makoto. He reeked of body odor, having gone several days without washing his hair or bathing. He was in a pitiful state, yet he tried to maintain some dignity, lifting his chin and acting like he was still in control. He said, "Don't think that locking me up here means you've won. Willow only loves me." Makoto sneered. You're just my defeated opponent. You wasted all these years and still couldn't win her heart." I didn't feel the anger he expected. Instead, I calmly exposed his lies. "Willow left the police station several days ago. Has she come to see you?" His face instantly darkened, and he slumped, as if the weight of the world had fallen on him. He muttered, "So what if she hasn't come? I'm still her legal husband." I asked, "And what about your child? Are you sure Willow can take care of her?" Mentioning the child, Makoto finally lost his composure. His hands gripped the bars tightly as he urgently asked, "What do you mean by that? What happened to the child?" I stared at him. At that moment, Makoto resembled a mad dog. I suddenly felt how ridiculous it was to have lost to someone like him. It wasn't that I was at fault, Willow just lacked judgment. He impatiently demanded, "Tell me, what happened?" Makoto was on edge. I parted my lips and slowly said, "I heard that Willow was so caught up in self-pity that she didn't notice the child had been running a fever for several days. By the time she took the child to the hospital, it was too late. The child is still in a coma." Makoto's face twisted in disbelief as he muttered, "No way. That's impossible. My mother-in-law loves the child. She would never neglect her." I nodded. "Yes, when she was there, she would never neglect the child. But now, she's too overwhelmed to care for anyone." I had heard all this from my lawyer. Perhaps it was karma for the fake illness that had caused Willow and me to divorce. Since Willow was detained, her mother had fallen seriously ill and couldn't even leave her bed. Now, she was in a hospital bed, with no one to take care of her. Hearing this, Makoto seemed to shrink, his shoulders drooping as if 10 years had been added to his age. The next day, the verdict was delivered. Makoto was convicted of illegally entering someone else's home. He was also found guilty of causing someone's death due to his reckless behavior, knowing that his actions could provoke someone and lead to death, but failing to take proper precautions. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter. With sufficient testimony and evidence, Makoto did not appeal the sentence. He would spend the best years of his life in prison, and even after his release, his criminal record would follow him. In a way, I had avenged Grandma. After this incident, my life returned to a brief period of peace. But to my surprise, a month later, Willow came looking for me again. Chapter 23. By this time, I had already started my own business. Using the capital from selling the house, I founded my own tech company. This 5D animation modeling company was a rare sight in our small town. At first, I was the only one running everything. I was so busy I barely had time to breathe, meeting clients, recruiting staff, designing, and spending most of my time at the company, even eating and sleeping there. I barely had time to go home. Willow came to visit a few times, but she was always turned away. Later, when I hired more people, Willow somehow found out where my company was and came looking for me. Unfortunately, the building had excellent security, and without a pass, she couldn't even get in. Willow had no choice but to wait outside. Some days she brought lunch boxes, other days she brought flowers. She came every day, always carrying something different. The lunchbox contained food she had cooked herself. She stood at the entrance, pleading with the receptionist to pass it along. "I don't need to come inside. I just want you to give this lunchbox to your boss. Is that okay?" she asked. The receptionist had already gotten fed up with her and immediately shook her head, refusing. "I'm sorry, I don't have the authority to accept things from outside," the receptionist replied. Willow insisted. "This is food I made myself. It's clean." She carefully opened the box to show her, revealing burnt red braised pork and stewed eggplant. It was probably from rushing too much on the way, and the food had spilled everywhere. Willow awkwardly wiped it with her sleeve and then pushed the box towards the receptionist. "Just let him take a look. If he wants to eat it, fine. If not, just throw it away," she said. The receptionist, still in her early 20s, Couldn't bring herself to reject her after seeing Willow's pitiful appearance. She took the lunchbox and, during her lunch break, took it upstairs. I had just finished a meeting when I noticed the pink lunchbox sitting on my desk. I frowned and asked, "Who sent this?" From the front desk, the secretary answered as she walked over. "Wasn't it your delivery?" I shook my head. After a whole morning of meetings, I hadn't had the time to order food. The secretary, confused, walked over and opened the lunchbox. When she saw what was inside, she couldn't help but feel speechless. She complained, "Where's this from? It doesn't even look appetizing." I fell silent for a moment. After a long pause, I finally spoke. "Call the receptionist up here." The secretary, noticing my serious expression, quickly walked away to do so. The receptionist came up nervously, and seeing my expression, she looked like she was about to burst into tears before I even said anything. She apologized. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wong." I saw how pitiful that lady looked, and she kept begging me. So I just. The secretary now understood. She realized that there had been a woman loitering downstairs for the past few days, and her colleagues had noticed her. Everyone was talking, speculating that the woman must have some connection with me. Looks like the rumors were true. The secretary felt a bit uncomfortable but still asked seriously, "Mr. Wong, should we get the security to remove her?" I tapped my finger on the table for a while before shaking my head. "Don't bother with her." I then looked at the receptionist and said, "If this happens again, don't come back to work here." She quickly responded, "Yes, Mr. Wong." Relieved, the receptionist hurriedly left. The secretary, watching me with a stern expression, opened her mouth, as if she wanted to ask something but hesitated. Finally, I spoke first. "Go ahead, ask whatever you want." The secretary, gathering her courage, asked, "Boss, is that your ex-girlfriend? She seems pretty infatuated." I answered, "She's not infatuated," I said lightly. "She only realizes that her life can get better when I'm around." The secretary, still somewhat unsure, asked, "Then are you planning to get back together with her?" Chapter 24. I shook my head and walked over to the windowsill. Looking down at the figure lingering below, I spoke slowly. "A love that comes too late is worth less than weeds." With that, I picked up the lunchbox from my desk and threw it in the trash. But Willow didn't give up. After realizing that sending food wasn't working, she started bringing flowers. She bought a huge bouquet and arranged them at the entrance, forming the numbers 520, symbolizing "I love you," attracting a crowd of onlookers. People on the upper floors also started taking photos. I could hear Willow's voice shouting from below, "George, please give me one more chance." Her voice, traveling through the glass, reached my ears and suddenly reminded me of how she once pursued me. A room full of flowers, and a floor full of absurdity. She stood in the sea of flowers, smiling brightly at me, holding a bouquet, and walking toward me step by step. She said, "George, I like you. Would you be with me? If you don't want to, it's okay. If not this time, then next time. Willow, will definitely win you over." Back then, people used to say she was a rare beauty, hard to win over, but in that moment, seeing the bright smile of the girl in front of me, I was moved. But because of that brief moment of infatuation, I gave her all of me and ended up with nothing in return. Her feelings came quickly, but they disappeared just as fast. The intense passion I once felt only ended up burning me. Willow came again and again for more than half a month, coming early and leaving late, trying all sorts of things, but she never waited for me at the company entrance. What she didn't know was that the BMW she saw passing by every day was the car I was in, the very one she was desperately waiting for. Eventually, Willow stopped coming. I told my lawyer to stop following up on her. It seemed like Willow had completely disappeared from my life. 6 months later, my business had taken off, and everything was going well. I returned to the capital once more to attend my good friend David's wedding. The moment David saw me, his eyes lit up, and he quickly walked up to me, giving me a big hug. "Brother, you're finally back." He let go of me and looked me up and down. "George, it looks like you're having a second spring in life. You've become even more handsome." I smiled and replied, "Stop kidding. Today you're the groom. Who could be more handsome than you?" He insisted, "I'm not joking. Just look at yourself." David pointed to the mirror opposite us. "I was worried that you'd be affected by the divorce, but it seems like it's given you a new life." I followed his gesture and looked at myself in the mirror. I was wearing a sharp suit, with my hair slicked back, exuding confidence and brightness, just like the way I had imagined myself as a young man. This should have been my life from the beginning. But unfortunately, I met Willow when I was at my most idealistic about love. I thought I had found my one true love and gave up everything, my parents, my career, and my life, just to revolve around her. In the end, not only did I lose the love, but I also lost myself. The only thing I'm grateful for now is that I came to my senses in time. It's not too late. I straightened my back, gave David a pat on the shoulder, and said, "All right, it's your turn. Go on. Hurry up." I sat down and watched David standing on the stage with a smile, gazing at his bride. The bride, to the sound of the wedding march, slowly walked up the aisle. The light shone on them as they exchanged their vows for a lifetime of togetherness. Do you take her as your wife? I do. Do you take him as your husband? I do. A figure sat beside me. I turned my head to see that it was Willow. Of course, David didn't invite her. She had come uninvited. I looked at her coldly. Willow spoke softly. George, please don't look at me like that. She had lost a lot of weight. Her face was sunken, and she seemed dull and lifeless. She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears and regret. She didn't say the arrogant things she once did. Instead, she sincerely complimented me. George, after leaving me, you've become so much better. I didn't respond. I simply turned my gaze back to the stage. Willow didn't speak anymore. She sat quietly beside me. After the wedding ended, Willow had a drink and then turned to me, asking, "Can we talk? Just one last time?" Chapter 25. I refused her. I said, "I don't think there's anything left for us to talk about." As I watched many people leaving the venue, I stood up to leave as well, but Willow, who had barely spoken, suddenly grabbed my hand, her voice almost pleading as she said once more, "This really is the last time." Her eyes were filled with tears, and the gaze that used to be full of charm now seemed dim and dull. After a long silence, I finally said, "Come with me." Willow's eyes lit up. I added, "I'll go say goodbye to Hao Tsung first." With that, I walked over to David. David clearly saw Willow, frowning as he asked, "How did she get here?" "I certainly didn't invite her," I replied. "I know. I just wanted to let you know that I'm leaving." David's eyes widened as he asked, "You're not thinking of rekindling things with her, are you?" "I'll be the first one to disagree." I laughed and said, "Am I the kind of person to go back to an ex?" David immediately shook his head. I said, "Then it's fine. I just want to have a final conversation with her." "All right. If you need anything, call me, brother," David said, speaking with his usual enthusiasm. I patted him on the back and gave one last look at his bride, who was waiting not far away. "Congratulations on your marriage," I said, silently hoping he would live a happy life, unlike me. I then turned around and walked back to Willow. Willow was waiting for me, her expression full of hope. I took her to the cafe across the street. We sat by the window, and Willow looked around, her face filled with melancholy as she gave a self-deprecating laugh. She said, "I confessed my feelings to you here, remember?" She had once poured all her love into me without reservation, and that was how she finally won my heart. But once we were together, I ended up making the most sacrifices. Willow's heart trembled slightly as she looked up at me and asked, "George, is there really no chance for us anymore?" I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have listened to my mom and faked a divorce to deceive you. I shouldn't have married Makoto. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup as she pressed her lips together. "Please, for the sake of the years we spent together, give me one more chance." Her gaze was intense, like it used to be. Back then, they were both young and fearless. She thought she could love the men in front of her for a lifetime, but later, it was she who broke her promise. The man in front of her was too good, so good that she thought that even if she made a small mistake, he would forgive her. What she didn't expect was that I had changed. I had been through too much, and my mindset was no longer the same. I looked at her calmly and said, "We don't have a chance anymore. Some things, once done, are done. It doesn't matter the reason. It's like this cafe. Even the owner has changed, and the taste of the coffee is different now. It can never go back to how it was." Willow's face turned pale once again. She left in a daze, never to appear before me again. I stayed in the capital for a few more days, spending time with David, and during that time, I learned things I didn't know. After Lou's mother was hospitalized for a few days, she passed away. Throughout it all, Willow never showed up. The police had tried to find her, but they learned that she had quit her job and had no fixed address. She had disappeared completely. Her mother's body was unclaimed after death, and the hospital had no choice but to send her directly to the crematorium. All I can say is that karma had caught up with her. With business to attend to, I returned to my work after a few days in the capital. In the course of a year, I had opened 2 more branches. During this time, I also started going on blind dates. Some were gentle and sweet, others were passionate and bold. Every girl I met was wonderful. After leaving Willow, I realized there were so many good women in the world. On my birthday a year later, after finishing a blind date and heading home, I received a call from an unknown number. Chapter 26. When I answered the phone, there was no sound on the other end, but I knew who it was. Until the clock struck midnight, a hoarse voice finally spoke, "Happy birthday," and then, the phone was quickly hung up. After that, she never contacted me again. A few days later, when I was on a business trip in the capital and having dinner with David, he suddenly asked, cautiously, "George, do you still have feelings for your ex-wife?" I was stunned for a moment, then laughed and said, "What? Are you trying to play the mediator?" In the years since, my career had been flourishing, And while I had met a few potential matches, my love life had remained stagnant. My parents had been anxious about me, growing a few more gray hairs, thinking that I had been so hurt by Willow that I was unable to move on. They always subtly urged David to pry into my feelings. But this time, David wasn't asking on their behalf. David furrowed his brows, speaking hesitantly. Just tell me, do you still have feelings for her? I shook my head and smiled. No, not anymore. Since the day she married someone else, there's nothing left. David let out a relieved sigh and slapped his chest. Good. Now I can tell you something without worrying. I raised an eyebrow. Curious. What is it? David leaned in and said, Willow is dead. I froze for a moment and asked, dead? How did she die? David had been watching my expression closely, and when he saw that I was only stunned and didn't show any sign of sadness, he finally relaxed. He said, stomach cancer. I heard she was already sick when she attended my wedding. She secretly left the hospital to come, and after the wedding, she went back to continue her treatment. I have a friend who works at the hospital. He told me that at first, she had enough money for chemotherapy, but later, she probably ran out of money and didn't ask for help. She just got some medication and discharged herself. On your birthday, she couldn't hold on any longer and passed away. Her mother was already gone, and her relatives didn't care about her, but Willow had made arrangements with a funeral home beforehand, gave them some money, and had her cremated. So that phone call was the last one from Willow before she died. A sense of emptiness washed over me. We had known each other for 7 years and been married for 4. Even though the love was gone, it still felt like losing an old acquaintance. All the love and resentment we had were gone, swept away with death. I only hoped that we would never meet again in the next life. After hearing the news of Willow's death, I went to the hospital to inquire about the child. The child had already regained consciousness. Willow had been responsible when it came to her child. When we were together, she had been careless with money, but she had spent all she had left on the child's treatment. After Willow passed away, the child was left orphaned and had to be sent to an orphanage. I visited her at the orphanage. She was a sweet little girl. After taking the chips I gave her, she innocently asked, Uncle, do you know my mom? When will she come to pick me up? At such a young age, she didn't yet know that her mother would never come back. I squatted down and gently patted her head. How about I take you to meet your new dad and mom? They were a couple of foreign partners of mine, who had no children but had always wanted one. After meeting the girl, they were very satisfied and immediately applied for adoption. The process was quick and they were approved. When the contract was signed, I specifically reminded them to keep their contact information and home address confidential. After finalizing everything, the couple took the child and flew overseas. Chapter 27. Later, I stood at the top of the city, looking down at the place that had given me both joy and pain. I realized I couldn't even remember where Willow and I had been together. In my memory, we talked about everything under the sun, saying that once we had money, we'd travel the world together. But in the end, the only place she and I walked through was a corner of the city. The rest of the world, I had to walk alone. In the distance, a familiar figure seemed to pass by, but the wind at that height was too strong, stinging my face, and before I could make out the figure below, my secretary arrived. She said, Mr. Wang, it's cold up here. You should come inside. She continued to nag. Mr. Wang, you really need to take care of your health. If not, we won't be able to enjoy the food you make. That'll ruin all our motivation to work. She was joking. Of course, I'd only cooked a few times during company team building events, and the employees had given me loud applause. I said, you're such a flatterer. You should be in sales, not as my secretary. I teased her with a laugh, then suddenly remembered when I'd made a whole table of dishes for Willow. She had picky tastes, turning her nose up at everything, claiming none of it suited her. I had thought maybe my cooking was bad, so I bought a ton of cookbooks, followed recipes online, and practiced constantly until I could cook both Chinese and Western dishes. But even then, Willow never praised my food. The most I got was a dismissive, "It's okay." I chuckled and said to my secretary, "You sure know how to make people feel good. No one's ever praised my cooking like that." The secretary immediately said, "That's because they didn't know how to appreciate it. Mr. Wang, your cooking is just as good as a professional chef's." I gazed out the window. Willow, do you hear that? It's you who didn't know how to appreciate it. A few years later, I remarried. The person I married was the secretary. We grew fond of each other over time. She was capable, gentle, and most importantly, she appreciated me and saw the best in me. After our marriage, the secretary soon became pregnant. But even so, I didn't let her stay home and be a full-time housewife. I valued her abilities and wanted us to grow together, not to lock my wife away like a canary in a cage. Then, Makoto was released from prison. After serving his 7-year sentence, the first thing he did was contact me through someone, wanting to meet and talk. I didn't meet him. I only spoke to Makoto over the phone. He said, "I want to." Before he could finish, I cut him off. I know what you want. You want to find your child. But I'm not going to tell you where she is. You will pay back tenfold the pain I felt from losing my grandmother. I will make sure you and your child never meet again. You bastard. Makoto cursed. I'm going to kill you. But now, his anger held no weight. After everything, I had become someone Makoto could never reach. I said indifferently, if you're not afraid of going back to prison, feel free to come. But I'll tell you, she's doing well, but you'll never see her again. As for Willow, she's dead. With that, I hung up the phone. My wife, who had been quietly standing by, couldn't help but speak up. Why did you say that? You sent the child away to give her a better life. I glanced at her and said, Makoto is not a good father. If he finds her, the child will suffer again. No matter what grudges there are between the adults, the child is innocent. I looked off into the distance and said, as for the hatred, let it end with our generation. From that moment on, I completely left the past behind. It wasn't too late, the breeze was just right, and everything was heading toward a bright future.